Well, these are readers, so I can't see everybody out there, but thank you, each and every one of you, for being here tonight. I think we're really going to impress our author with how many people have showed up. He does these a lot, and he told me he thought there were going to be a lot of people, and thankfully for us, there are. I'm Kelly Linville, Mayor of Bellingham, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the beautiful Mount Baker Theater. I always tell people I had my first dance recital here when I was 5 years old, and I will not tell you how long ago that was. We are here to celebrate the wonderful book written by Daniel James Brown. When Pam Kiesner, our library director, gave me a copy, I could see it had something for everybody. It's a sports story, it's an underdog story, it's a history book, and a heartfelt human interest story all rolled into one, as all of you who have read the book know. It's a story for sharing with parents and grandparents, and even with children who have that competitive spirit. As a local girl, it was particularly inspiring for me to explore all its local connections. Rower Joe Rance has ties to the Deming area. Gordy Adams, another boy in the boat, graduated from Mount Baker High School. And there's so many places that are familiar to me and are important settings in the book. From the University of Washington, where I started my college career, to the Puget Sound region, to the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. This book has heart. As the men of the 1936 Olympic crew team struggled to achieve perfection and win a race against all odds, they were far from home and in a country on the brink of war. Daniel James Brown grew up in the San Francisco area, attending UC Berkeley and UCLA. He taught writing at San Jose State and Stanford before devoting himself to writing nonfiction. I asked him if it was okay if I called him Dan, and he said as long as I first introduced him with his full long name, because you might think that we were here to discuss the Da Vinci Code, which is Dan Brown's book, but he said he goes by Dan in his regular life. One of Dan's many talents as a writer is his interest in the people who are part of history. He gets to know who they really were and conveys that in a very compelling way that keeps his readers turning the page. In addition to Boys in the Boat, Dan has written The Indifferent Stars Above, the harrowing saga of a Donner Party bride, and Under a Flaming Sky, the great Hinckley firestorm of 1894. All of Dan's books can be found at my library, the Bellingham Public Library, and other area libraries, as well as through Village Books. They have quite a supply out there, I hope you all saw. Dan, welcome to Bellingham, and thank you for these compelling stories that bring history, people, and places so alive for us. Please join me in welcoming our 2015 Whatcom Reads author, Daniel James Brown.
Wow. Thank you, Mayor Kelly, and thank you all for coming out. This is, I'm sure, the largest crowd I've had so far on this incredible experience I've had as this book has grown and grown and grown, and it's really grown almost entirely through word of mouth. This book never had a New York Times review or a Today Show appearance or anything like that. It's really been people talking to other people about it that has allowed it to flourish as much as it has. And so I thank all of you for making that happen. It's all of you that have brought me here tonight. The Boys in the Boat is a story, of course, about these 9 young Americans who went to Germany in the summer of 1936 to the Berlin Olympics. And I always like to start by acknowledging that most people, when they think about the 36 Olympics, the first thing that comes to mind is the Jesse Owens story. And with good reason. You know, the Jesse Owens story is one of those great American stories. we tell it to our kids and our grandkids. We put it in our textbooks, partly because it's one of those stories that helps define who we are as a people, what we value. Basic things like fairness and equality and great individual achievements. I think this story of these 9 kids from Western Washington who went to Berlin on the same boat as Jesse in the Manhattan that summer, I think it also deserves to be told and retold because it also helps remind us of who we are as a people. And it reminds us of some of the same virtues, but it's different in one very important way, and that is that the Jesse Owens story is a story of a great individual achievement. The Boys in the Boat is really a story of great team achievement, and I think it helps to remind us that, at least historically, we've been a people that have been pretty good at building great teams and getting things done together. And frankly, I'm not sure that's as true today as it has been historically, and I'd like to come back to that toward the end of the talk. But first, let me talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, because that's really so important to what it became. I live down in King County in Redmond, sort of in a rural, semi-rural area east of Redmond. And although it's a semi-rural neighborhood, we have this hideous thing called a homeowners association. And that requires that we get together every year to argue about what color you may or may not paint your mailbox or other similar weighty issues. And I don't know, you may like your homeowners association, it may do good things for you, but mine is, I think, composed of the 12 or 15 most cantankerous people in Western Washington. I'm indebted, though, to my HOA for one thing, and that is that the meeting was at my house 6 years ago, and after the meeting, one of my neighbors, a lady I knew only as Judy at the time, came up to me and introduced herself and said that she was, her dad was living with her under hospice care at her home. He was in the last couple months of his life, and she was reading my first book to him, Under a Flaming Sky. And he was really enjoying that book, and she wondered if I would come down to meet him. So I think it was the next day I went down, and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was very weak. He was stretched out in a recliner. He was on oxygen, but he was very alert mentally. And I sat down and I talked to Joe just for a few minutes about that other book, but Judy had an agenda that I wasn't aware of. Judy had been looking for years for somebody to write her dad's story and the story of this crew, which I was about to find out. So Judy turned the conversation towards her dad's experience growing up during the Depression, and if you've read the book, you know that Joe had a very difficult family situation to overcome as an adolescent, and he told me that story, and that in itself really got to me and affected me. But then he began to talk about how he and his crewmates, beginning in the fall of 1933, had come together and become members of this rowing team at the University of Washington, and how they had wound up rowing for an Olympic gold medal in Berlin against, amongst others, a German boat in front of Hitler. And as Joe told me this story, I became absolutely mesmerized by it. I think my jaw literally dropped. And as Joe was telling me this, though, I noticed that from time to time he was tearing up. And so I knew there was a lot of emotion there. I wasn't quite sure what was happening at first. I thought he was crying for the loss of his crewmates, most of whom had passed away in the preceding few years. But as we talked more, I began to understand that really there was a lot of pride and joy in those tears. And I came to understand that he was crying partly for the sheer beauty of remembering what they had all done together. And at the end of the conversation, I asked Joe, I hadn't gone down there intending to find a book topic at all, but it worked. And I just blurted out and surprised myself. But I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And he looked down at the floor and he shook his head and he immediately said no. I don't want you to write a book about me. And then I'll never forget this, because he looked up, and there were tears in his eyes, and he sort of croaked out. He said, "But you could write a book about the boat." And it took me a moment. At first I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this beautiful cedar shell that they had rowed in 1936. But then, of course, I realized that it wasn't the physical boat. It was the physical boat, plus all those boys who had been in it and what they had done. And more than what they had done, what they had all become. You know, that summer 75 years before in Berlin, that almost perfect thing that they had become, that unified, breathing, single thing that a great crew is. And I was tremendously moved by that. And so the next day I set out on what turned into about a 4-year odyssey of researching the story and trying to understand it inside out and write it. Now, since the book has come out, I get emails all the time from readers around the country and actually increasingly around the world. And there's certain comments that come up over and over in these emails. And one of them is every day, one or more people say, I almost didn't read your book because I thought it was about rowing, and really, what could be more boring than a book about rowing? And, you know, fortunately, they go on then to say, wow, I was wrong. It turns out it's about so much more than rowing. And indeed, that's what I discovered, too. In those 4 years that I worked with Joe's daughter, Judy, and we researched this topic, it turned out to be so much more than about rowing. It turned out to be a big, epic, sweeping story about the human heart. It was a story about this one boy, Joe, who learned first that he couldn't trust anyone in his life, not even his own parents, and then learned that to get what he wanted out of life, he had to learn to trust others on a very deep level. It was a story about an almost mystical figure, a sage-like British-born boat builder named George Pocock, and how he shaped the lives of these 9 young men. It was a story about a somewhat hard man, Al Ulbrichtson, their coach, and his obsession with realizing an Olympic dream. It was a love story. It was a story about grit and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. It was about punishing pain and psychological devastation, but also about ultimate jubilation. It was a story about the American genius for defying long odds. It was about the cold realities of life in America during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. It was a portrait of Seattle during the Depression. It was about Joseph Goebbels and Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl, about propaganda and deceit, about democratic values come face to face with Nazi cynicism. And really on that level, it was pretty starkly a story of good and evil. But most of all, it was a story about these 9 decent, hardworking young men who came together to forge something much larger than the sum of their parts. Now, that's not to say that rowing isn't central to the story. Rowing is really the stage on which a number of human dramas unfold. And, you know, I have to say, 6 years ago, I would have been one of those people who most probably would not have picked this book up, because I didn't know anything about rowing, and I wasn't interested in rowing, and I would have assumed that it was essentially only about rowing. But I've become a big fan over the last 6 years for a number of reasons, but mostly just that I've discovered rowing's actually a lot more interesting than I had thought it was. And I just want to tick through some of the things I think are interesting about the rowing part of it. First of all, there's the extraordinary physical challenge involved in rowing. There's really very few things that humans do, either in athletics or in any other endeavor, that match rowing for the sheer output of energy and the extraordinary demands that it puts on the human body. A rowing coach once said that putting 8 men or women in a shell and asking them to row a 2,000-meter race is like asking them to play 2 NBA basketball games back to back and do it all in about 6 minutes in terms of the toll it takes on the body. Just extraordinary amount of physiological exertion. There's very few things that match rowing for coordination and synchronization and teamwork. Another rowing coach pointed out that asking these 8 men or women to row a race in one of these shells is like giving them golf clubs and putting them in front of 8 golf balls and asking them to swing and hit those 8 golf balls at precisely the same moment, and then to do that over and over every 2 seconds or so for 6 minutes. Extraordinary amount of synchronization and precision involved. There's the incredible mental toughness of the sport that required to keep at it day after day. You know, particularly out here in the West, here in Bellingham or row on Lake Whatcom or Lake Samish or down in Lake Washington, people row all winter long around here. In the East, they row in these concrete tanks in the winter. In Seattle and in Bellingham, they row out in the snow and the sleet and the rain and the cold cutting wind all through January and February. And it takes a lot of mental fortitude to get up and do that time after time after time, particularly for a sport that really doesn't offer a lot in terms of monetary reward or glory. There's a long, colorful history associated with rowing. I don't remember if it was Yale that challenged Harvard or the other way around, but in 1852, Yale and Harvard had a boat race, a rowing race. That was the first intercollegiate athletic event in this country, the first time 2 schools met in an athletic contest. There's the aesthetics of the sport, and especially in these days I'm writing about when they rowed in these beautiful wooden shells, a crew that has found its swing out on a misty lake early in the morning really is a gorgeous thing to behold. And finally, there's a lot more drama in rowing in a crew race than might be obvious to someone standing on the banks of a lake watching the boats go by. So much of the drama, though, takes place inside the boat. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book is put you in the boat so you could understand the drama of these races as it unfolds from the vantage point of somebody sitting in one of those seats. And a great deal of the drama in the 1920s and 30s and 40s arose from the enormous crowds that rowing attracted in those days. It's hard to believe now just how popular crew was then as a spectator sport. 100,000 people would turn out, and not just for the big regatta in Poughkeepsie on the Hudson, but on Lake Washington, 70, 80, 90,000, 100,000 people occasionally would turn out on a Saturday afternoon to watch one of these crew races. Same thing down in the Bay Area, same thing in Wisconsin, same thing in Boston on the Charles. People would turn out in the tens of thousands. Radio, which was then a new medium, would cover races live coast to coast, and millions of people would tune in to listen to these races. Prominent oarsmen were featured on the covers of national magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. A coxswain's sore throat could make headlines in the newspapers. And actually, at the 1936 Olympic in Berlin, the second largest spectator venue was the rowing regatta grounds out at Grunau, second only to the big Olympic stadium that the Nazis built in Berlin itself. So it was really high drama. There was a great deal of drama associated with rowing in those days. And I'd have a passage I'd like to read to try to illustrate, and I hope give you a sense of that drama if you haven't read the book. But I'm going to pick it up partway through a race, so I need to sort of create the context or set the scene here. This bit I'm going to read takes place in June of 1936 in Poughkeepsie, New York, on the Hudson. This is the de facto national championship. There's about 100,000 spectators there. Many of them are on the hundreds of boats that are lined up the last mile or so of the race course, everything from rowboats to a Navy destroyer. There's an observation train that runs parallel to the race course, packed with thousands of fans. The race gets started about 6 p.m. in the evening, just as dusk is falling because of tidal conditions on the river. Now, to nourish their dream of going on to the Olympics later that summer, these kids from Western Washington really need to win this race. And in particular, they need to defeat their arch rivals from Cal Berkeley. Kai Ebright, the coach at Cal, has won the 2 previous national championships, but more importantly, from Washington's standpoint, California has twice gone to the Olympics and twice brought gold medals home to Berkeley. Al Ulbrichtson, the Washington coach, is absolutely obsessed, I mean literally obsessed, with making sure that Washington brings the gold medal home to Seattle instead. And in fact, he's told his wife Hazel that if he can't do that in 1936, he's done with coaching. So Al Ulbrichtson is watching this race unfold from one of these observation cars, and as he's watching it, his whole career is on the line. He has told Bobby Mock, his coxswain, to race from behind, but under no circumstances to get more than 2 lengths behind. But for the first 3 miles of this 4-mile race, Bobby Mock has been holding his boat a staggering 4 lengths behind. And Bobby Mock, I should mention, is not above lying to his crew about where they are in the field if it helps keep them motivated. But Ulbrichtson is watching this unfold from this observation car. He's surrounded by Washington coaches and by Washington's press writers, sports writers, and he can't believe what he sees unfolding in front of him. So let me pick it up there. On the train, Al Ulbrichtson had all but given up. "They're too far behind," he muttered. "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish third." Ulbrichtsen's face was ashen. It seemed to have turned entirely to stone. He'd even stopped chewing his gum. In the lane nearest to him, California had powered back out in front, rowing beautifully. With a tiring field behind them and less than a mile to go, Cal was in a commanding position to win. Kai Ebright, it seemed, had somehow outwitted him again. But if anybody had outwitted Al Ulbrichtson, it was his coxswain, this short kid with his own Phi Beta Kappa key, and now he would show his hand. Suddenly he leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichtson." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then a lie. "Here's California, we're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." Very slowly, the Husky Clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. Someone on the train idly remarked, "Well, Washington's picking up." But a minute later, someone else called out much more urgently, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" On the train and on shore, all eyes shifted from the leaders to 8 white blades barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another deep guttural roar began to rise from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish line now, still in third place, 2 lengths back, but they were moving, and the way they were moving compelled immediate and absolute attention. In the boat, Mock was incandescent. "Okay, now, he barked. Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him just as smooth as silk, and the boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past the middies as if the Navy boat were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain, Grover Clark, glanced across the river, and for the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up on his stern. Stunned, he bellowed at his crew to pick it up, and Cal's rate climbed quickly to 38. Mock hollered at Hume to take it up another notch, and Washington went to 40. The rhythm of the California boat seemed to waver, then grow erratic. California and Washington careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. People in rowboats were standing up now, risking a dunking to see what was happening. Some of the large excursion steamers began to list toward the center of the river as people crowded their rails. The roar of the crowd began to engulf the oarsmen. Boat whistles shrieked. On the float in front of Washington's shell house, a Vanda Mae Calamar, the crew's cook, waved a frying pan over her head, whooping and urging the boys on. In Washington's press car, pandemonium broke out. George Farnell of the Seattle Times shoved his press credentials into his mouth and began to devour them. Tom Bowles commenced beating a stranger on the back with his lucky old fedora. Royal Brougham was shouting, "Come on, Washington, come on." Only Al Ulbrichtson remained motionless and silent, still riveted to his seat, his eyes cold gray stones locked on the white blades out in the river. Joe Williams of the World Telegram stole a glance at him and thought, "This guy has ice water in his veins." With the finish line looming ahead of him in the gathering dark, Bobby Mock screamed something inarticulate. Johnny White suddenly had the sensation that they were flying now, not rowing. Stub McMillan desperately wanted to peek, to glance over toward lane 1 where he knew California would be, but he didn't dare. In number 6, over the crowd noise, Shorty Hunt could hear someone on a radio yelling frantically. He tried to make out the words, but all he could tell was that something terribly exciting was happening. He had no idea how things stood except that he still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down to one action, one continuous movement, one thought, the crew's old mantra, running on through his mind like a river, hearing it over and over, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp Oxford accent, mind in boat, mind in boat, mind in boat. Then, in the last 200 yards, thinking itself fell away, and pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, descending on all of them at once, searing their legs, their arms, their shoulders, clawing at their backs, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, rowing at 40 strokes per minute, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat. By the time the two boats crossed the line, in the last vestiges of twilight, a glimmer of open water showed between the stern of the Husky Clipper and the bow of the California Clipper. In the press car, the corners of Al Ulbrichtson's mouth twitched reluctantly into something vaguely resembling a smile. He resumed chewing his gum, slowly and methodically. Standing next to him, George Pocock threw back his head and howled like a banshee. Tom Bowles continued to flog the back of the fellow in front of him with his lucky old fedora. George Farnell removed the well-masticated remains of his press credentials from his mouth. In Seattle, Hazel Ulbrichtson and her son Al Jr. pounded the glass top of their coffee table until it shattered into dozens of pieces. In the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. For a long while, Ulbrichtson just sat there, staring into the darkness as fans came rushing through the car, congratulating him and slapping him on the back. When he finally stood up, reporters crowded around him, and he said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he elaborated, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." Thank you. Thank you. And you know, that's really the moment at which these guys knew how good they were, I think. It's the moment at which I think the sports writers back east realized how good these guys were. I think Al Ulbrichtson never really doubted Bobby Mock, I think, from that moment on. And they went on, in fact, from there. A couple weeks later, they went to Princeton to the official Olympic trials, where they very handily beat California again and all the other entrants and won the right to go to Berlin as Team USA. And the story culminates, of course, in this extraordinary gold medal race in Berlin in August. And in a moment, we're going to show you a clip from that, film from that. But just to give you a sense of what these guys were up against that day, it was a windy, pretty miserable day in Grunau, this little village outside of Berlin on the Longer Sea, where the race was being held. The guys from Western Washington, Team USA, had turned in the fastest qualifying time, and the Brits had turned in the fastest qualifying time. But at the last minute, they were mysteriously assigned lanes 5 and 6 out in the widest and windiest part of the Longer Sea, where they would have to row into a stiff quartering headwind. The German and Italian boats had turned in relatively slow qualifying times, but they were mysteriously assigned lanes 1 and 2, which were sheltered virtually the whole length of the race course. The American stroke, Don Hume, the stroke is the guy that sits right in front of the coxswain and sets the rhythm for the whole boat, so he's absolutely critical to the success of the boat. Don Hume had been sick on and off for weeks with a respiratory infection, and for the few days leading up to the medal race, he'd been in bed running a high fever. He was a very sick kid, and only at the last minute did Ulbrichtsen agree to put him in the boat, and only because the other guys in the crew insisted on it, basically. But he was very sick as he climbed into that boat. There were about 75,000 fans there that day, most of them German. There were some Brits and Americans there. Hitler and Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Goering and pretty much the entire top tier of the Nazi hierarchy were there that day, standing on a balcony of a stone boathouse looking out over the race course. As the rowing events got underway, Germany won gold medals in the first 5 rowing events of the day. And so the fans became more and more excited. Hitler, and there's film of Hitler and Goebbels and Goering up on the balcony, patting each other in the back, and Goebbels is doing this funny little thing where he's jumping up and down. And the crowd began to chant, Deutschland, 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 as the American kids are rowing out to the starting line for the 8-oared race. The 8-oared race is always the big prestige event, the main event of the rowing at the Olympics. And so as the Americans are rowing out to the starting line, the crowd is chanting Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. They line up at the starting line. Because they're out in the windiest part of the course, they don't hear the start when it's called. They don't know the race has started till they see the boats off to one side lurch forward. They dig hard, they row out into the middle of the Longer Sea. 1,000 meters down the race course, halfway through the race, they and the Brits are tied for dead last. Bobby Mock is sitting in the coxswain seat, watching waves break over his bow and watching Italy and Germany streak down lanes 1 and 2 towards what seemed to be inevitable gold and silver medal finishes. But that is not how it ends. And if we can do this now, we're going to show the video of what happened and how it did end. You won't see the American boat in this film until very near the end, by which point they've gotten back into contention, and they'll be up at the top of your screen.
Die Entscheidung im Achter. Schweiz, Ungarn, England, Amerika, Italien und Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal bei den Olympischen Spielen hat sich ein deutscher Achter bis zur Entscheidung durchgekämpft.
These are the Germans in the near lane, the Italians next.
Italien kommt auf.
Italy.
Deutschland greift an. Deutschland holt auf.
Germany.
Zieht gleich. Die Wikinger gehen in Führung.
Americans. The Italians in headscarves.
Endkampf ist entbrannt. Die letzten 100 Meter, das deutsche Boot im Vordergrund. Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener. Dahinter die Ungarn, neben diesen Engländern.
There are the Americans.
Auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf. Meter um Meter. Zu spät, zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika. Zweiter Italien. Dritter Deutschland.
Bob Mock, Don Hume, feeling better, Joe Rance, Shorty Hunt, Stub McMillan. Anyway, isn't that cool? In case you're wondering, there weren't cameras in the boat. The day of the Golden Age. All the pulled back shots there, this is from Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda film Olympia. And all the pulled back shots are shots of the race as it unfolded. But she got the Americans, the Germans, and the Italians to row again the next day, and she put cameras in the boats so she could get those close-ups of the coxswains and the oarsmen, and then she cut those in to the footage of the race. It's an amazing piece of film. Okay, so along with the comments I get about the book saying how boring they expected it to be, there's a couple other things that come up in emails over and over. And one of those is I get email every day from, and for some reason particularly from men, but from both men and women, from people saying they just finished the book and they had tears in their eyes as they finished it. The other thing that comes up all the time is I get emails from people on one side or the other of our current political spectrum, often very far to one side or the other, saying that if only the people on the other side would read this book, the world would be a much better place, which I find is fascinating. I had absolutely no political motive in writing this book. But I've been pondering those sort of two prominent reactions, trying to figure them out and trying to understand why it is that such a wide range of people have such a strong emotional response to this story. I think part of it is just sort of a general hankering for a time when we were better able to build teams and get things done and life seemed simpler in many ways. But I think another big part of it is I think the qualities that these particular young men embodied are the kinds of values or qualities that pretty much all of us value, regardless of our political philosophies. And so I just want to go through some of those because I think they are what made these guys what they were. First of all, I think it's really easy to identify with this particular bunch of young men. Their humble origins really stamp them as quintessentially American. These are kids, most of whom grew up in mill towns and on dairy farms or in logging towns around the Northwest, including Gordy Adam, who graduated from Mount Baker High. They were kids who grew strong, wielding pitchforks and axes and shovels to get where they wanted, what they tried to go, where they wanted to go, to do what they wanted to do, they had to go up against first their very good rivals at Cal Berkeley, but then they had to go up against kids rowing for the Ivy League schools in the East, kids who in many cases had learned to row in prep schools, kids who were oftentimes the sons of titans of industry or U.S. senators or even presidents of the United States. FDR had 2 boys rowing at this same time. Then they had to go up against and challenge and defeat kids from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, kids who were in some cases literally aristocrats. Then they had to go up against and defeat what was essentially a hand-picked Nazi crew. So they were classic American underdogs, and I think we all have an appreciation for that. And the second thing is very closely related to that, and that is it's very hard not to admire their perseverance. These kids were extraordinarily tough, both physically and mentally. They, the 9 kids who went to Berlin were the end product of a process largely self-selecting that whittled hundreds and hundreds of kids down to the 9 that wound up in that boat you just saw. They were the ones who hung in there season after season in the middle of the Depression, when they were having a hard time feeding themselves. They were the ones who were out there every afternoon in January and February, rowing in the wind and the sleet and the snow and the wind, and they kept coming back for more and more of Al Ulbrichtsen's very stern, very difficult coaching. And so I think you have to admire that kind of perseverance, and I think we all do. The third thing, they were extraordinarily earnest about what they did. They believed in the importance of what they were doing. Now, obviously, when they went to Berlin representing the United States, they believed in the importance of that. They were proud of that. They took pride in that, as I think any of us would. But it wasn't just when they were rowing in an Olympic race that they were proud of their rowing. To really understand this, you have to understand George Pocock. And just very briefly, if you haven't read the book, George Pocock was this British-born boat builder who wound up at the University of Washington early in the 20th century and began to build these beautiful handcrafted cedar racing shells. And by the mid-1930s, they were so state-of-the-art and so beautiful that every rowing program in the country either had or wanted a Pocock shell. But the thing about Pocock is he was a very good oarsman and a very good boat builder, but he was above all a craftsmanship. He believed in craft. And he taught these 9 young men, and many others who rowed for Washington, to approach their rowing as if it were a craft. He said, when I build a boat, when I build a shell, when I walk away from it, I leave a piece of my heart in it. And when you row a race, you should leave a piece of your heart in that race. He believed that there was a spiritual value to joining in with others and doing the best job that you possibly could. Every chapter in the book begins with a quote from Pocock because I wanted his spirit to sort of infuse the book, and I'll just read one that's sort of typical of all of them. He said, "It's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you are rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine." So he was something of a philosopher and a spiritual guide to these young men. The fourth thing I think that stamps them and makes them what they were and that enabled them to do what they did is that they had an extraordinary amount of mutual respect and trust. Trust is absolutely essential in rowing. The moment you step into, those of you who row, know that from the moment you step into a shell, every movement you make affects everybody else in the boat. And so the whole art of moving one of these boats gracefully and quickly through the water requires an enormous amount of mutual trust and respect. Everybody has to be doing the right thing at the right moment. And when you become a member of a crew that's really functioning well, you really give up a big part of yourself and become part of something bigger than yourself. And that requires a lot of trust. And by the summer of 1936, these 9 guys had developed trust on a level that's almost impossible to overstate. One place it was very evident was in their bond that they formed was as the gold medal race was approaching that summer, nearly all of them either sent letters home to their parents or wrote in these journals that they kept. And they all talked about, well, I really hope we can win this race. I hope we can beat the British, and I hope we can beat the Germans, and so on. But at some point or another, virtually every one of them said, but most of all, I hope I don't let the other guys in the boat down. That was the thing that they worried about more than anything else. It wasn't whether they came home with a gold medal or not for themselves, but whether they let the other guys in the boat down. And then the final thing is perhaps in some ways the least obvious, but I think maybe the most important. And that is that each of these guys had a conspicuous measure of humility. And make no mistake, these were young, big, tough, strapping young men, and they all had healthy egos, and you have to be fairly audacious to go out for something like this. But over those 3 years that they came together as a crew, there was a lot of pain and frustration and suffering in learning to row, and that had a cumulative effect. It taught them some humility. It taught them there were things that they could do better together than apart. It taught them that they could learn things from one another, that they could learn things from Ulrichsen and Pocock, that they could learn things by studying the guys who rowed for Berkeley, for instance. They learned this measure of humility that I think allowed them to open up their hearts to one another and approach one another and build those bonds of trust that I was just talking about. And I have to say that humility is something that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. A lot of these guys came home and put their gold medals in sock drawers and closed the drawers and went out and got jobs. And in some cases didn't mention to their own kids until their kids were grown that they had ever rowed in an Olympic race, let alone won a gold medal. Joe Rance, for instance, working at Boeing, worked alongside many people, and many of them that I've talked to said, I sat next to Joe for 10 years, and I never knew this about him. And he was typical in that way. They tended not to talk about it later in life. They really were humble in a way that's almost hard to believe. So let me sort of wrap up here by saying that when I stand back from this story and contemplate what it means for me, the story of these 9 young men who climbed in a shell and learned to pull together so beautifully and so powerfully, I think it's an almost perfect metaphor for what that generation of Americans did. I'm talking about the generation that is my mother and father and aunts and uncles, the generation Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. Everybody in that generation, beginning in the fall of 1929, as the crash and the depression began, they all were humbled. They all experienced privation to some extent or another. And I believe, obviously there are exceptions, but I believe as a whole that generation learned that same kind of measure of humility that allowed them to come together and listen to one another and get things done and start building great teams and do things like build the Grand Coulee Dam and win World War II, not on one but on 2 separate fronts, and then after the war to build the most prosperous period in our history. And so I'm a big fan of that generation, and I had an experience, I had the opportunity when I was about to write the concluding chapters of the book. I wanted to go to Germany to see the race course at Grunau, and I had an opportunity to go up on the balcony where Hitler had stood and watched the race. And I had a kind of emotional moment up there, and I'd like to just close by reading 2 or 3 paragraphs from very near the end of the book that talk about what that was like for me. I visited the Wassersports Museum in Grunau, where late in the afternoon, Werner Philipp, the director, kindly led me up a set of stairs to the balcony of House West. I stood there for a long, quiet minute near where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer Sea, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, and preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, his blades glinting, worked his way down one of the lanes towards the large Yale sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw but did not recognize heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of House West, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to have an opportunity to do some questions and answers here in just a moment. Before I do that, I just wanted to read an announcement to you. If any of you are interested in finding out more about rowing, there's a club here in Bellingham that offers Learn to Row classes. The Whatcom Rowing Association just opened a new boathouse at Bledel Donovan Park on Lake Whatcom, where they offer programs for juniors and adults alike. And there's a WRA table in the lobby manned by club members. So if you want to learn more, just stop by their table, and I'm sure they'd be glad to tell you. Thanks again. So I think we're going to do some questions.
Okay, now we have the chance to ask some questions of Daniel. So we do have microphones set up in both aisles, one there and one over there. So please make your way towards the mic to ask your question, and while you finalize your question and line up, as I know you're going to. Come on, Bellingham. We like to ask questions. I'm going to start with the first one. Mm-hmm. I read the book with both of my book clubs. We had great conversations. And one thing that struck me as you were talking backstage and I was reflecting on what I read, I was wondering about how the relationship between Joe and his family, how did you research that and talk with Joe about that? It seemed so extreme and so intense.
So the relationship between Joe and his family, particularly his stepmother, was very, very difficult, as you know if you've read the book. Joe only lived about 2.5 months after I met him. And what was fortunate for me as a writer is that Judy, his daughter, had spent the last couple years of Joe's life following him around, literally with a pad of paper and a pencil, asking him things like, that night your family left you in Squim, what were you thinking? What did your dad say? What food was in the house? And so a great deal of that came down to, Joe told me a lot of it, but then Judy filled in a great deal more, talking about the family dynamics. And I have to say, every time Judy began to talk about this, there were a lot of tears, even 75 years after the fact. And even though it was her father who had experienced this rather than herself, it's still a very emotional topic for everybody in the family. And so And so I made a point of paying very close attention to what Judy had to say. But I also wanted to sort of confirm that by finding out what Thula's kids had to say about it. And so the only one I was able to talk to was Harry Jr., Thula's son. And I went to Harry, and Harry loved his mom, Thula. But when we got to that topic of why did she keep kicking Joe out of the house, every time that came up, he just put his head down and shake his head and said, I don't know. I've been trying to understand that all my life. So I don't really know the answer to why Thula was Thula. But there was, as I say, it opened a scar that has lasted through generations. So, we have more questions?
One quick one. You mentioned that the Nazi team was sort of handpicked. Do you find that modern Olympic teams are handpicked these days with corporate culture?
So the question is, I'm sorry.
Do you find that modern rowing teams are handpicked with the corporate culture we have?
Yeah, well, I mean, the process is so different now. I mean, in the 1930s, a whole school would go to the Olympics, or a whole rowing club would go as a crew, as a unified crew. And now the process is rowers go to Olympic camps, and they compete against one another, and they try out against one another. And so you wind up with 8 very good men or women, very good oarsmen or oarswomen, but they're not necessarily a crew, and there's a lot of debate about that because they don't have the years to come together and learn to be a cohesive whole the way that this crew, for instance, did. So that's the fundamental difference between then and now. I honestly don't know much about how the modern process involves, corporate influence or not. I just can't really answer that with any authority. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I'm struck by the recent amount of what I would call narrative nonfiction, narrative history books. And when I was reading yours, it may be a small point, but perhaps lead to a greater discussion. The moments of, you mentioned Seabiscuit, and there was an herbal supplement or a dietary supplement. You also mentioned them seeing Zamperini from Hillenbrand's other book, Unbroken, on the boat. And the interconnectedness of that, I'm wondering, were those sort of Dickensian coincidences? Were those shocking to you, surprising? Was something that you found in your research, and how does that relate to The Greatest Generation and the popularity of the subject?
Yeah, I mean, Laura, I'm a huge admirer, first of all, Laura Hillenbrand in particular. I mean, I admire a lot of people that write that, Tim Egan and Eric Larson, but I particularly admire, I think, Laura Hillenbrand. And in fact, the day after I met Joe and I decided I wanted to write this book, my wife and I were going to Hawaii for a vacation. I had an old paperback copy of Seabiscuit, and I took that with me. And I spent the whole vacation almost reading through it and marking it up, every single page in that book, studying it for the writerly decisions that she had made. And then when I was about halfway through writing Boys in the Boat, I got an advanced copy of Unbroken, and I did the same thing. I studied her very carefully as a student studies a master, because I think she's I really think there's nobody better than her at this kind of writing. And so a lot of the same themes do come up, because when you delve into that generation, you're going to find these themes that just are there all the time. This hardscrabble struggle to survive, and the kinds of qualities that allow people to survive those hard times. And in many ways, you see those same qualities, I think, in Louis Zamperini in Unbroken and in Joe Rance in The Boys in the Boat, even though Joe didn't obviously spend years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. I think you see the same themes because the underlying reality was the same. And so yeah, and there's absolutely no accident that if there's a resemblance between her books and mine. Actually, I tell you very quickly a little short story. About 2 months after The Boys in the Boat came out, I was on Facebook chatting with my daughter about something, and up popped a little thing from Laura Hillenbrand saying, "Friend me?" And I said, okay, yeah, I'll friend you, Laura Hillenbrand. And so I friended her. And then about 15 minutes later, a thing popped up, and she'd written an instant message, and she had just finished The Boys in the Boat, and she loved it, and she went on and on about it. And all kinds of great things have happened to me in regards to this book, but I think that may be the greatest thing ever, because you know, when you have somebody you admire that much and you're trying to rise to that level, and then you get validation from them, it just is, it really feels good. Anyway, yeah, yes.
I have a two-part question that's related. One is, when you're writing so much about the team effort, I wonder if you could, how you reflected on that with writing being such a solitary effort. And then secondly, the effect that writing about people that were so in search of perfection and how that affected you.
Yeah, good. That's interesting. The second part first, it absolutely had an effect on me. I mean, I wound up totally inspired by these guys. By the time I was done doing the research and starting to write about them, having gotten to know them through their various family members, and looking at what they had done, I was personally inspired to try to do absolutely the best I could in bringing their story to life. In fact, I felt a very heavy burden of responsibility, particularly to Joe, because I had seen those tears in his eyes, to try to be as much of a craftsman as I could. And so Pocock had a huge effect on me just in terms of the kinds of things he was saying to these boys. They resonated with me as well. And I'm sorry, I forgot this is the danger of two-part questions for me.
It had to do with the solitary nature of writing and...
Yeah, so, you know, I am a pretty solitary writer. I mean, I don't have a book group or anything. I write by myself pretty much. I show drafts, though, to my wife, and then I began to show drafts to rowers. So the actual writing, I tend to be pretty solitary, but I also have to say that in another way, this is a very collaborative book. First of all, Judy was virtually a co-author with me on this book. We spent hundreds of hours together talking through her dad's story. She connected me with the family members of all 9 guys in the boat, and those people spent many, many hours with me talking about their father or their grandfather, as the case might be. And then rowers got involved, as I say, reviewing drafts of the manuscript. So although the writing was done, you know, by me alone in my office upstairs, the overall work of pulling it together and gathering the information and making it happen, there were dozens of people involved in that, and in that sense, it very much was a team effort. Yes, do I see another question?
What a wonderful book on so many different levels, Mr. Brown. Thank you.
Thank you.
As I'm sure you're aware, Coach Elbrickson continued to coach rowing at the University of Washington until 1959. And in 1958, the year before his retirement, he enjoyed another monumental day in the sun by being invited to take on 6 Soviet rowing teams on the Kaminsky or Kimki, I guess it was, reservoir in Moscow. And it was a truly marvelous season, a very unusual one for Washington because they were under IRA sanctions. He was considering retiring. They had their first opportunity to race at Henley, which they had never done before in the illustrious history of the Washington rowing program. And as kind of a bit of foreign intrigue, things were going on with the State Department and the Soviets to do a people-to-people type of race that would pit one American team against all these mighty Soviet teams, yeah. The Russian Army, or Soviet Army, I should say, the Trud Club of Leningrad and so on, who had absolutely obliterated Washington at Henley. And it's a great story because Washington came out of nowhere, beat them all handily in the Swift Shore, their boat at that time. have you considered? I think I speak for everybody here who has read and enjoyed your book. Have you considered a sequel? Actually, maybe just a continuation would be more appropriate, because this is the 1958 win. And God help me, I was old enough to remember it when we heard it in the middle of the night when young Keith Jackson called it from Moscow, to possibly do this as a follow-up.
Well, the first I ever heard that story, actually, I was listening to KUOW in Seattle. This was shortly after I'd begun work on The Boys in the Boat. And it was the author of a book about that crew. And I don't know any more than that. I neglected to go try to find that book, but I believe at least one book has been written about that event. So I would want to look at that at least before I did anything. I think I know that my editor and my agent would rather I didn't write another rowing book, just because it's kind of like actors, you can get sort of typecast. Personally, I wouldn't mind, but I would have pressures on me to go in a different direction. So I'm still trying to figure out what that direction is, by the way. Yes.
Thank you for writing the book. It was really wonderful. I enjoyed it. My book club really enjoyed it. But the other character that you haven't talked about as much, and I'd like to know a little bit more about, and the research that you developed on Pocock and how they constructed the boats.
So, George Pocock is a story, I've sometimes been asked if I would be interested in writing a book about Pocock. There actually is a book about Pocock. Pocock was just absolutely fascinating, both because of, the man only had a middle school education in England, and yet he could drop quotes from Dante or Homer or Shakespeare just like that. He spent his life educating himself, reading literature deeply, reading philosophy, and he became a very wise man, mostly through his own effort. He also, sort of tellingly and revealingly, when he grew up, his father and all his family had a very strong Cockney accent. He was working in the boathouse at Eton College before he came to the United States. He was apprenticed to his father as a boat builder. They were building boats for these kids rowing at Eton, the kids of aristocrats, British aristocrats. And those boys all spoke with crisp Oxford accents. He spoke with this Cockney accent, and he just decided that he was going to fix that. And so he taught himself to speak the King's English, and for the rest of his life, he spoke this perfectly nuanced and crafted English. And that's very typical of him. He was always trying to seek to do something. He saw that as better English than Cockney. Take that as you will. He was always seeking to improve on everything that he did. And so, that was fascinating. And then the actual art and craft and to some extent science of building these cedar shells, I could only go into that in so much detail because you lose readers at a certain point. In fact, that's one criticism I do get about the book, is that there's too much about the boat building. But I became obsessed with it, and I wrote way more than's actually there, because it's absolutely fascinating. He didn't use power tools, even after power tools were readily available to him. He insisted on using these old tools he had brought over from England because he wanted to feel the wood under his hands. So just an absolutely fascinating man with many, many different dimensions, and one really could write a very interesting book about him, I think. Yes.
Dan or Daniel?
Yeah, sure, either way.
First, I just wanted to say thank you for taking me back again this evening to that excerpt that you read when the boys were competing against Cal Berkeley on the river there. And your ability to take us all there, to put us in the boat, although I will say that I wasn't quite in the boat, I was on the train.
That's good, that's where I wanted you, yeah.
Yeah, and you had me right there in the moment. And I found myself kind of fabricating some metaphors myself between you writing it and the boys in the boat and what they were experiencing. And so I was wondering, after you finished that excerpt right there, that writing, I was wondering, how many times you wrote that? Or did it just come to you in an inspiration and you just cruised right through it, it flowed, you were in the swing, and after you got done, you just like, yeah, I nailed it!
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Or did you have to go to Joe afterwards?
So, yeah, I mean, let me tell you a little bit how I write a scene like that, because I think it answers the question. Particularly for this book, but for every book I've written, but particularly for this one, I think entirely in terms of scenes. I don't write chapters. I write scenes. And a scene might be 3 paragraphs, or it might be 10 pages. But it's between 2 camera cuts. It's one discrete scene. And so I very much looked forward to writing that race scene. I mean, I waited and waited for 2 years to get to the point where I would get to write that race scene, because I'd been reading about it and studying it, looking at photographs of it. And that's what I do. Once I know what a scene is going to be, and in the case of a race, it's pretty obvious. It's the beginning of the race to the end of the race. I research the heck out of it on a very, very granular level. I find out when Al Olbrechtsen was chewing his gum and when he wasn't. I was challenged about that in an Amazon review. Somebody said, how could you know when Al Olbrechtsen was chewing his gum and when he wasn't? Well, actually, I do know, because Al Olbrechtsen was in a car full of press people, sports writers, and they were studying Al Olbrechtsen as much as they were studying the race, and they were commenting on his facial expressions and when he was chewing his gum and when he wasn't. And so it helped a lot that there was this enormous amount of ink spilt about rowing in those years. Wonderful sports coverage of rowing then. And so the way I work is I accumulate all these little details about the scene, like Olbrechtsen's gum and so on and so forth, until I get to the point where I can't not write that scene. I mean, I get to the point where it's just got to come out. And I keep having to do this, and again, excuse the image. For some reason, about half the time this happens to me when I'm in the shower. And I suddenly realize I know exactly what it's got to be, and I come bolting out of the shower, and anyway, I make my way with a towel around me to the computer, and I sit down, and I just write that sucker. I mean, it's splat. It goes onto the page all in one fell swoop. And it almost always works for me. I don't sit in front of a computer very often just trying to figure out what the next sentence is going to be. I wait until it's so formulated in my mind that it's just... Now, that's not to say it comes out perfect. It often doesn't. Another thing I do is I then take that scene and I stick it in a drawer, and I have a rule. I won't look at it for at least a week, and better several weeks, because I know when I come back to it and look at it with fresh eyes, I will see stuff I like and see stuff I don't like and want to tweak this or tweak that, or maybe the whole scene just stinks and I want to throw the whole thing away. But I can't know that until I've let it sit for a while. But anyway, yeah, I mean, writing that scene was particularly fun because there was the energy of the race, and I was pretty hyped up about it by the time I was writing it.
Dan, when you described George throwing his head back and howling, you had me howling. It was great. Thank you.
That's great.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
2 more? Okay, I'll take one over here.
Well, I have 2 questions, so...
I'll forget one of them, so it doesn't really matter.
I know, but I got it written down, so you'll be able to remember it. But you've kind of alluded to it in the last question, but do you have any other general advice for writers of young writers of creative nonfiction, besides getting into the research and getting into scene and stuff like that?
Well, first piece of advice is to do it. I mean, I waited till I was in my mid-50s before I started doing this. That's one of the biggest regrets of my life. I wish I had started many, many years ago. Because it's true that writers write, and the actual just sitting down and doing it is the first and most important thing. You know, I mean, everybody's different, but I do think there's a lot of value in, if you're writing narrative nonfiction, creative nonfiction, whenever it's possible to try to think in cinematographic terms, to try to think in terms as if you're behind a camera. I do that a lot. I mean, when I'm writing about Joe and Roger walking across campus and walking down to the Shell House for the first day of turnout on October 5th, 1933, part of what's going on in my head is I'm trying to decide whether to zoom in on them or pull back and show the students around them. When I get to the Shell House, do I want to look into the inside of the Shell House? It helps me a lot to think as if I'm behind a camera lens. That doesn't work, obviously, for things that aren't fairly visual, and also to employ all the senses, sight, sound, smell, everything you can think of. So for this particular genre, I think that's one thing that's really important. Another thing, and it's something I learned from studying people like Laura Hillenbrand, is be careful about where you start and end scenes. I mean, always end a scene, if possible, in a way that leaves your reader wanting to pick that scene up a few pages down the line. Because I'm weaving together many strands, and so I'm interrupting the action periodically. And so I try to end a scene or end a segment with something that will make the reader want to keep going and pick that up further down the line.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Second question.
Yes.
Hi. First thing, as a member of the Whatcom Rowing Association, I just wanted to congratulate you in accurately depicting what it is like in the boat. I can say that it is very accurate. Second thing, I was wondering, the story about Joseph Goebbels and the propaganda at the time is very fascinating as a book in and of itself. I was wondering, though, what compelled you to add it to the story? Because you could have very easily left it out and it would have been still really great.
Right. I have to tell you, I became obsessed with Goebbels and the Ministry of Propaganda and the way the Nazis in the mid-1930s manipulated public opinion and used propaganda to do that. I spent months reading way more than I actually needed to about that topic, and I wrote about 80 pages that came out of the book. I got so obsessed about it. The reason, though, that I did all that, I mean, I wound up paring it way down, but you know, at the end of this book, there's a boat race. And on one level, that's all it is. It's a boat race. But it isn't just a boat race. It really, because there's a German boat there, and a fascist Italian boat there, and an American boat and a British boat, I wanted my readers, when they got to that race, to remember what was at stake symbolically in that race. There were two very, very different views of the world represented by those boats. And in that sense, it was so much more than just a boat race. And that's why watching that film is so compelling for us today, is because we know what was about to happen in Germany. So, I mean, we all know about the Holocaust. I wanted to just remind people of how Germany became what it became, and therefore what was at stake, you know, when those boats finished the way they did. So.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.